Alright, I wanted to go over a quick thing about parenting. So I'm going to make a sphere and a cube. Oh god, that's huge. I'm going to make a sphere and a cube and a cone, because I think cones are, for some reason, good for this stuff. So I just wanted to go over basically like turning a constraint on and off. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just duplicate this cone, what the heck. So I'm going to go ahead and constrain this cone to this sphere. Might actually be doing it the opposite way, we're going to find out. Double check my settings, cool. Yes, I did that the opposite that I wanted. I do this every single time I set up a constraint, so you're just every single time. Alright, there we go. So now, if I move the sphere, it moves the cone. But if so say I want to go ahead and if you've ever clicked into a constraint, looked in the channel box, and been like, cool, what is this weird number thingy? This is like the weight of a constraint, so basically 1 is on, and if you set this to 0, it's off. The downside about doing something like this, for some reason, and I guess now that I think about it, it kind of makes sense, you don't really need to understand super why necessarily, but if you only have one basically parent object for this or one thing driving the motion, it's either on or it's off, and there is no in between. So you can't really do like a nice smooth thing where it like fades from this over to this kind of deal. So there's a way around that. I'm gonna go ahead and just throw this back whatever. I guess it doesn't really matter. So delete my original constraint. So there's a few different ways to sort of handle this. So the easiest thing to do is to show you on two objects. So I'm going to grab these dudes and then grab the little object I want to constrain, parent constrain them, and you'll see that if we move the circle, the sphere, it's going to move the cone, but not quite as much as before. You can see like eventually the sphere goes off and it kind of like leaves the cone where it was. And then same thing with the cube. So both of these are controlling the objects. If we look at the parent constraint itself, you will notice that now instead of having only one of these little weights, there are two. And it's going to tell you, what object this is. So like P-sphere, it's just going to use whatever name is in the outliner for that. But now we have the ability to go in and sort of smoothly toggle this on and off. There is one weird thing that drives me nuts. But basically, for some reason, it doesn't cap this at 1, so you can just make this as high as you want. But like because this P-cube has a weight of 1, it still will vary, you can see it kind of like jiggling the cone. So personally when I'm working, because I find that like hella confusing, I will just cap this at 1 and then I will turn this one off. So you can do, values of like 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 or like whatever. But I recommend capping this instead of just sort of like arbitrarily making this like a really crazy large number, because it's just sort of hard to keep track of and not clear on. Especially when like I've had stuff with like 10 different things controlling it I was trying to toggle back and forth between, and it got like really weird if I just made it giant numbers. So it just sort of keeps everything easy to work with, in my opinion. But again, so what this allows you to do is have this nice sort of toggle back and forth between your objects. And obviously if one of your objects isn't moving, you can kind of use that as a way to basically like turn this constraint on or off. So I'm just going to sort of set some terrible random keyframes here. Go into my constraint, and I'm just going to go ahead and I'll set this to, if you set it to 0, both of these to 0, it'll just go back to where it was originally. So I'm going to say, cool, it's constrained at the beginning. I'm going to go ahead and keyframe both of these, and then a few frames later, I'm just going to, this was a weird thing, it seems like it's going to kind of like stay in the vicinity it was. I'm going to sort of move it over to the cube, and then I will just move this back and turn that off, basically. So doing this, you can get some really nice sort of smooth interpolation between your keyframes. And then it still kind of does that terrible thing at the end where it's like snaps back to the original position. So that's obviously not super ideal. So what you would want to do if you did ever want that to just sort of go back to the original position, this is my dumb sort of cheat that I do to do this. It's worked well. It's a little bit cumbersome, like a little bit awkward. So what I'm going to do is just make a null group. Have nothing selected, do Control-G, it'll just make a little null group there. And I'm going to select that null group, the sphere, the cube, and then my code. So as long as whatever object you want to be controlled is the last thing you select, everything else should be added as a to those pair constraints. So again, now we have an extra little groupie dude there. So what I'm gonna do is just set. I'm gonna do the same thing I did before. So I'm just gonna go ahead and be like, cool, follow the sphere, and then go back and stop with the sphere and go over to the cube. And then I have auto key turned on, by the way. And then go to my null group and go over to here. And great. So what this should do is follow the sphere, sort of go back over to the cube, but the cube's not moving, so that's just sort of like where it is. Let me actually just maybe move the cube, so that's slightly more obvious. So it's gonna, again, follow the sphere, go over to the cube, and then kind of go back to where it was before. And you'll notice that it's not snapping perfectly to these objects. That is because of a setting that I used while setting up the constraint. I've honestly not found a way to toggle this, which is really weird to me. But basically it is because I had maintain offset turned on. So I will show you another version of this. Let me duplicate this cone. Just delete this constraint. If you duplicate something with a constraint under it, the constraint does nothing, so I'm going to get rid of that. Alright, so I want my sphere, my cube, my null group, and then my cone. I will turn off maintain offset. And what that's going to do is basically move the cone physically to be inside of the other objects whenever the constraint is activated. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and set up the exact same keyframes that I had before. Right click and do key selected. So first we're going to follow the sphere, so these should both be 0, and then we're going to go over here. So you'll notice again that when I do this, in this case it's actually moving the sphere directly into the objects. So this can be handy for something like picking something up, where you want it to kind of like snap into the hand, basically. And then there's like one more thing that I want to show you after that. Alright, so here we have, again, attached. Okay, let me actually shift this slightly. So we have attached to cone, goes over almost all the way to the cube. Oh, because I screwed up and I didn't keyframe that over here. Alright, so cone hits cube, bounces back to 0, which is the origin. And that's only because that's where my null group is. If I move my null group, it's going to follow the null group. Alright, so this is great, but let's say, like, you know, again, maybe this is like animation of picking something up or something weird, you throwing it back and forth between characters, whatever. And I want this to, imagine, again, so sphere throws this cone over to the cube. This should totally have some kind of rotation or something else on it. A lot of times, for some reason, I don't know why this is suddenly working, but, okay, good, it broke. Well, not good, but I expected it to break and it did. So as soon as I set that keyframe on the cone, the parent constraint kind of broke on it. So you don't really have great control over your code once you do this. And again, you can see the values here. These little blue-gray boxes basically indicate that these are constrained or being controlled by some outside force, in this case, the constraint. So what we want to do, in this case, is actually, I'm going to demonstrate this with a torus, because I'm a dingus. Okay, so we have a torus. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to parent that under my cube. So imagine, or sorry, under my cone. And I'm going to 0 that out. That should snap it directly into the cone, and I will just make that a little bit larger. So, this is where it gets a little weird. I'm trying to spare you guys watching me set up this entire thing with the keyframes again. So now what I'm able to do is this torus is going to follow this cone, and the cone is what is being driven, right? Like if we look at the torus, you can see that none of these values have those little blue bars on them. I'm still free to rotate everything, whatever as I need. So I can keyframe this freely and just do some crazy nonsense with the rotation and like rotate it like a maniac. And you can see that it's doing that, you know, as it's doing the motion. So if you're looking to sort of set something up in a relatively robust way, what I would recommend doing is, I guess I'll sort of go through this again. So let me just actually just hide that. All right. So the first thing you want to do is like make your object that you actually want to move, right? All right. Cool. Zero that out, or like put it wherever you need it. Make a group for that, and just call that like object offset or control or whatever you want to call it. So this is this thing. This group is what you're going to be using to constrain to your other objects that you want to actually control the cylinder or whatever. So basically what that's going to do is, again, allow you a little bit more control of this. You'll be able to like move the rotation and all that because it's following this null group. And by using a null group, or not, well, I guess not a null group, it has the code in it. By using this group, you don't have something like physically in your scene that you need to look at. The downside of that is you do need to select it in the outliner if you need to get to it. Quick hack for that, though, is actually just click on your object, press F, and it'll just expand it. So if you can see your object, it should be pretty easy to get back into your outliner. And that's pretty much it. The other thing you can do is, this is actually how I usually set up stuff. I'll just do another null group, and I'll just call this like my weird like constraint null, or whatever you want to call it. Where this is just sort of the thing that I make to toggle my constraints. Just so I can get that smooth rotation if I want it. It's not ideal, it's just sort of the best thing that I found so far. So again, if I want to set this up, grab the objects you want to control things, in this case this little null group that I made, cylinder, and then this object offset. You should be doing nothing theoretically on this cone. I'm going to go to constraint and parent, and I had maintain offset turned off, which is fine. So again, that just really depends on whatever you're trying to do at the time. But what this allows me to do is, again, I can rotate this cone freely, not have that be affected by the constraint, which is exactly what you want. And then I'm able to toggle directly onto the cylinder and also be like, okay, I don't want this in the cylinder. Maybe he's like picking it up like this. So now we can kind of move that over a little bit and kind of compensate for, whatever you need to compensate for. And then you can be like, okay, now I want this to move freely. Toggle that back up manually to 1, and then set this to 0, and then it's attached to your null group. Now you might be wondering, why is this off-center? Because my null group is on the origin. That's off-center because I moved this, so if we just key that back to 0, it will be perfectly on that null group. It's also going to allow you can move it like, wherever else you want in your scene. It's kind of janky, but this is kind of the best way that I've found to set up constraints for, stuff like picking up objects or whatever other weird stuff you want. If you need to have the camera moving from, maybe it's like following one character through the scene and kind of like onto another one, you can do the same setup where you have this group that's controlling your camera. Instead of a cone, you would have a camera, and then it would just use the characters instead of whatever these random objects are. So that's, I guess, helpful. I've had one or two people ask about that, so I wanted to sort of do a video about it, but hopefully that all makes sense. I guess just sort of a more in-depth look at constraining stuff that maybe would be helpful as you go about animating.